Hey, all of you, it's a pleasure to be with you in this manner. I wish I could be with you in person, but this will have to do for now. First of all, congratulations to Don Nichols and all of you for having the foresight to organize a conference on mindfulness to try to get people in the community to think about what they can do, what their role might be in order to make the community better. So as I approach this, the question that comes to mind is, who am I in relation to the community in which I am called to take action? So this has to do with self-awareness and being conscious then and mindful of what we each can do to make a difference, and that means being aware of both ourselves and our community. So I'm going to make this very personal because I do have a relationship with the people of Iuishti, and so I'm going to be answering this question for myself, and in that way I'm hopeful that it will be a model, if you like, for how you can approach your own role within your own community and in other communities to which you might feel called. So this starts off then with an awareness of self. Who am I really? And this calls to mind a certain concept that I've been pleased to learn about. The idea is proprioception. And it seems like a long, complicated word, but it comes from proprio, which talks about the self, and ception is what I receive. So it's about what do I receive from within myself. So proprioception is being really aware of what's going on inside you. That means being aware of emotions, being aware of new ideas, being aware of what excites you, being aware of what is, I don't know about that. And I'm hopeful that all of you will engage in being proprioceptive, I guess would be the way. Be aware of what happens within you as I'm speaking. At the end, I have my email address available, and if some of you are moved to say something to me in response to this, I'd love to get an email from you to get a sense of what is your response to what I'm sharing with you. So being self-aware then is also being attentive to the spirit. So what is the spirit? Well, we all have something of spirit within us. We're all interconnected to all that is, and there's also the spirit of the other around us, the spirit of the community, and the spirit of God, transcendent, the Creator, that wants to somehow get a message to us, and that message only comes if we're sort of attentive and open to what's going on. So as we do this, in the words of Thich Nhat Hanh, who actually, somebody sent us something, and Gloria just this morning read me a little thing about mindfulness, and part of that idea of mindfulness is to cultivate compassion. We also have to become aware of the community. And so if things along the lines of peace and reconciliation are to take place, it takes people who are deeply, deeply immersed in the community that really are aware of what's going on, what are the needs, what are people feeling, and what needs to happen and what could happen. So this awareness of the community includes being aware of the history, of the culture, of the religion, and of the role that you are called to play, and is that role one of being an insider or an outsider? Because you can say and do different things depending on whether you're inside the community or outside the community. In this case, I'm an outsider, although I've had lots of welcoming gestures, so I sort of feel I'm partly inside, but I'm not from James Bay, and I haven't grown up on the land, and I don't speak the language. But and in that regard, I can speak to you with a certain naivete because I don't know all the ins and outs of what's happening, and so nobody can think that I am directing my message toward a certain agenda. And so here's my story. I'm going to tell my story because all of this is about being self-aware. And so who am I then in relation to the community? And so my own background is that I grew up in an evangelical environment. I went to a Mennonite Brethren church, which was highly evangelical, participated in lots of evangelical activities. In many respects, I was an evangelical of the evangelicals. I even spent a summer in Europe with Operation Mobilization and did a lot of things to build up some of the evangelical churches over there. Now, the other part of my background I alluded to is that I'm Mennonite Anabaptist. So I went to a Mennonite church, which happened to be really evangelical. I ended up memorizing lots of scripture and really engaging in my faith, which was woven into my life. It's a little bit like pre-contact Indigenous people. They didn't have a separate religion. Their values and their ceremonies and everything were just woven into life, and to a large measure, my faith perspective was woven into my everyday life. However, certain things happened when I was around 20 that brought me to the end of the rope, if you like, in terms of being comfortable with all this. Actually, it started when I was about 13. I had some questions, but finally I reached a crisis point, almost committed suicide when I was 20, and this whole worldview sort of fell apart for me. And after that, I was open to learn from many traditions, but it sort of, with that openness, it meant that I could really be open to a whole lot of other people and accept them on their own right. I didn't have to look at any new person as somebody to whom I had to give the gospel message. For instance, I could just be open as myself in an authentic way to other people. So that was the benefit of it. The other benefit, of course, was that having hit rock bottom, I was really able to feel for others who had a deep amount of pain and suffering. But throughout all of this, I kept my connection to the Mennonite Brethren, then later the broader Mennonite Church. And central to that being connected was a desire to follow the way of Jesus. And so in my own tradition, where German was an important word, the word was an important language, the word Nachfolge, following after Jesus, was really central to what faith was all about, following the teachings, if you like. Now, academically, around the time when I almost committed suicide, I was really majoring in political science at university, and then because of my crisis, I didn't do too well in political science, so I switched to philosophy. But later I did an MA in Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, and for that I had to learn the Hebrew language. And as I did so, I started to realize that when you read the Hebrew Bible in Hebrew, you start to feel the earthiness, you start to feel the connection to the land, and you start to feel the fun, because there are lots of plays on words, lots of funny things in Hebrew that just don't come through in translation. And I think that gave me a particular affinity down the line for my relationships with Indigenous people. Along the line, it struck me that it's really terrible what humans can do to one another, and so I wanted to study deep-rooted conflict to figure out how and why do people commit atrocities, and that led me then to really study reconciliation and peace building. Now, I have another story. And this story has to do with my encounter with Indigenous people. In Herbert, Saskatchewan, where I grew up, there weren't Indigenous people. There was the odd student that came as a foster child to Herbert for a time, but basically we didn't have Indigenous people living there with whom I could have any contact. But when Gloria and I moved to Thompson in 1982, we were in a place where a third of the population was Indigenous, lots of Indigenous organizations, and I thought I really wanted to get to know Indigenous people. And so the very first fall that I was there, I went to the Native Awareness Days and started to build relationships. And then I thought, you know, one of the things I could do is to offer my services. So I got some Indigenous leaders together, we talked a bit, and I said, you know, I've got a gift of time. Gloria and I were co-pastors of a Mennonite church, and so the church said, don't do too much in the church because we want to be involved, so do whatever you like in the community. So I said, you know, I've got some time, what would you like me to do? And knowing something of my background, they asked me to organize a conference on the implications of self-government for criminal justice. And the process was very rewarding, and through it I got to know Ron Nadeau, who is head of Native Communications. After that conference, he and I started having lunch together every month, and as we talked together, it became clear that Indigenous people in Thompson didn't have a voice in the school board, on city council. They didn't have a way of letting people know what their needs were within the city. So we thought the idea of a Native Urban Council was a good idea, and he gave me the names of 17 outstanding Indigenous people, and he said, talk to all of these people. Tell them that if I had time, I would be doing this. So I spent at least 2 hours with each of these people listening to their stories, and that's where I really started to get my education about what did it mean to be an Indigenous person in Canada. Well, when we left Thompson, came to Ottawa, we kept up relationships with Indigenous people in many respects, and I won't go into the details on that. However, one of my teachers was Lee Oates, whom I got to know when I went to the Banff Conference on Family Practice. He was both the son of a medicine man and a clinical psychologist. And I learned a lot of things about the systemic oppression of Indigenous people from him. When it came time to do my doctoral thesis, rather than use a case study of a conflict overseas, I thought, let's look critically at what's happening here in Canada, and I focused on the Okanagan crisis, so that meant I read a lot of Mohawk history and learned some Mohawk words and so on. Then when I started doing social reconciliation, economic development, community dialogues, I was invited by Catherine Twin to adapt this for Indigenous people, and that led to my doing these community dialogues at Hobbema, south of Edmonton, among the Cree of Alberta, the Musqueam Cree. And so I participated in ceremonies. I went to Blue Quill First Nations University College, and participated deeply with the Cree people of Alberta during that time. So through this engagement with Indigenous people, there are a lot of things that I learned that have become really important for my own worldview, how I approach life. And I'll just run through these fairly quickly. First of all, the medicine wheel really opened my eyes to a lot of integrated dimensions of the human person, how the emotional and intellectual and physical and spiritual were all part of the whole that come together in the medicine wheel, and the circle of life and so on. Those things really added to my way of understanding my own life. Then seeing the interconnections of everything and the deep respect for the earth and for the four-leggeds and the two-leggeds, and the sense of, as you look at all the different directions and then you look up and then you look down to the earth, and just seeing from your vantage point, you're connected to everything that surrounds you. And then the idea of circles and circle processes, and how a circle has its own life. And my teacher was Max Solis, a Maliseet elder, and when I was working with CICR, Mac and I did a 2-day workshop on circle process, and so I learned from him so much about what's involved in a circle process and the role of the teachings at the beginning and so on. Then I learned this sense of how the land has a certain spirit, and Jim Elbert here in Ottawa, when he wanted to set up a sweat lodge, went all around the vicinity, and he'd look at one piece of land, another piece of land, and he always had the feeling, this is not quite right, this is not quite right. And finally he found a piece of land where he felt the spirit of the land was right, and he could build a sweat lodge there, which I had the privilege of, I was part of a sweat, in a sweat lodge, and I've been to others, and these have been really significant times of learning and self-examination and so on, then I learned about smudges. And smudges, you know, some of you I know are of a Christian orientation and might wonder about this, but to me I saw a certain resonance between what you do in the smudges. You say, okay, may I see good things, may I think good thoughts, may I hear good things, and it's a way of orienting yourself so that you're in a really good space for whatever is going to happen. And it reminds me of this verse in the book of Psalms: may the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable to you, O Lord. So the smudges draws on that even further. It's not only the words and what's in my heart, but also what I see and hear and what's before me and what's behind me and so on. But it's a way of very consciously becoming self-aware of who you are in relation to what's going to happen and preparing yourself. So I have a very special talking stick that was given to me, and I treasure it because it was a gift from an Indigenous woman. I also have a pipe. I'm a pipe carrier, but I keep the pipe detached because this is how you do to respect the pipe. And I don't use it because I haven't been given the teachings to use the pipe, but I treasure it, that I was honored to be given one, and if the time ever comes when I am to use it, I will be taught at that time. And so that raises the question of who am I in all of this? And I'm somebody who loves Indigenous people. I don't kid myself. I'm not one myself, but there's a lot of stuff inside me that has been shaped by teachings I've been honored to receive. So there's another story, and that is my connection to the people of Ishti. So Don Nichols and I met several years ago. I told him about about the process of community dialogues for social reconciliation, economic development, and he was really intrigued and said he wanted to see this happen among the 9 communities of the Ishti. I think I've spoken at the near the time of graduation for all of the people who have taken CICR training from Ishti, and I've had the privilege of doing introductory work to these community dialogues in Ujubugamu. And I just realized on my slide I misspelled Misdiciny, so here I am making a mistake in my spelling. But nonetheless, the important thing is that I started to build relationships with people from these 2 communities, and I'm looking forward to visiting the other communities at some time in the future. So this is all about mindfulness that has to do with peace, first of all. And so as we become aware of ourselves, we become aware of the community, and we start to say, okay, what is needed in the community in relation to peace? And it makes sense to make some distinctions then between negative peace, which is the idea of stopping the fighting or stopping the things that are causing problems. If there's a war, it means stopping the war, but you can also think about if there's a conflict happening where one person is hurting another in some way, shape, or form, then the first thing is to stop the fighting, if you like, and that's a negative peace. When that's over, it doesn't mean people really like each other or getting along super well, but at least they're not harming one another. The other side of peace is positive peace, and this concept was developed by the Boldings, who are Quakers, and Johann Galtung. But positive peace then is to really develop good relationships. And then a concept that has been further developed has been the idea of just peace. That is, you can't really have peace that is sustainable or that really works for people if there is injustice happening. So you have to find a sense of justice and then cultivate just institutions, because it just doesn't seem fair. It's out of balance. It's not right. If the institutions and the dynamics don't lead to people saying, oh, it feels right, it feels balanced, it feels like everybody's getting a fair shake, it feels like everybody has the same opportunities. It means that everybody is thriving or has opportunities. So we can also say, what then is reconciliation? And to me, reconciliation and peace are part of a bigger whole. Like the two emphasize certain things a little more than others, but there's a lot of overlap between peace and reconciliation. So reconciliation to me is first and foremost a transformation of the orientation, attitudes, and behaviors. And we could say values, but that first word, orientation, is really important. How are you oriented toward the other person with whom you've been living in unpeace, with whom you've had a conflict? And that orientation could be one of violence. I really want to see that person hurt some way or another, or that person brought down, or they're so high and mighty, what can I do to bring them down? Or the orientation could be toward blessing. What can the other and I do to enhance our well-being? And I'd really like to see the other person thrive. The orientation then leads to certain attitudes, which is a mindset and an imagination as to what we think could happen in relation to that. And these are then manifest in our behaviors and what we do to either further well-being or drag the other person down. So it's a transformation from violence to blessing. And in the process, this matter of letting go becomes really important, because we often hang on to our resentments, our hatreds, our negative feelings. And part of reconciliation is having a capacity to let go. So you can think about that as forgiveness. But one thing we do know is that if you have hatred and resentment, it's going to slow down your thinking, it's going to take away your creativity, and it's really hard to experience the positive emotion of joy if you're hanging on to those. So it becomes a really significant step to be able to let go of that sort of stuff. The other side of the coin is that we ourselves do things that have harmed other people. And so often we like to play the victim and only lick our wounds and think about what's been done to us, but we do things to other people. So part of reconciliation is taking responsibility for the harm caused, and taking responsibility means accepting it, owning it, showing that you've changed your attitude, you don't want to do it again, and doing whatever is needed to make reparations. So in the midst of all of this, you have to change the structures. You have to change the ongoing patterns that are harmful, because suppose you are reconciled at one instance. Okay, I've admitted what I've done wrong, I've forgiven you, we're reconciled, but the next day we participate in these patterns that are dysfunctional or that put people down or diminish them in some way or another. So part of reconciliation is changing that ongoing way in which we relate to one another as we build new relationships. And part of this then too is healing the trauma, because traumas can stick with us for a time. And there are some really interesting new techniques that have to do with healing trauma, which has to do with changing what happens in our mind, body, and the emotional part, so that we develop new patterns that don't bring back the hurt again and again. So as I'm thinking about the people of Iyu-Ishti, we can think about some questions in relation to reconciliation. Where is reconciliation needed? It could be within or between families, within or between communities, and between communities with Iyu-Ishti. I know that there are different historical things that have happened that have been troublesome, the ways in which certain negotiations were handled, things having to do with land and so on. So perhaps some reconciliation is needed around these kinds of issues, because reconciliation means that we move ahead together in a new space, if you like. But at one time I worked for the Assembly of First the Assembly of First Nations. Ovid Mercredi had invited me to do a number of contracts there. And so part of my hanging out with Indigenous people has made it clear that there are also conflicts between different First Nations, between Cree, Algonquin, Mohawk, Huron, Ojibwe, and so on. I know that in some communities, Inuit are very close to Indigenous, and there can be tensions there. I've also heard of places where the Dene are right beside the Cree, and so on. And so there are divided communities in that regard, and the Métis are another group, often misunderstood, and sometimes they have felt left out of what's been happening for Indigenous people. So there are those kinds of issues, and then Indigenous people and settler societies. So with all the things at the beginning of the list, I really don't have a particular role unless I'm invited. It's not for me to meddle, or it's not for me to even say, oh, you have a conflict there that needs to be addressed. That's not my role. My role is to walk the path and be supportive, but when it comes to Indigenous people and settler societies, I might have a role, because there are certain things that I might be able to do among settler societies that might contribute to a sense of justice and better relationships. So what is my role in all of this? Well, the first is to build relationships, and I feel like I have a number of really good relationships among people of the EU-Ishti. Another part of my role is to listen really carefully, and here we're getting back into an awareness, a mindfulness. So the first thing that I really need to do is to say, if I go among the EU-Ishti, I'm a guest, and my first thing is to really listen very carefully. And I remember when I was in Mysticiny, and one of my friends just said kind of casually, you know, we have this big tent set up with cultural things, and I'm going to be there around 1 o'clock. And it was just sort of a very gentle way of saying, you know, you'd be welcome to come. Well, Gloria and I were there together, and we went, and we learned so much being there and listening to what was going on. Then part of my role too is to share what I have to offer, whatever insights I have, what I've learned, what my perceptions are, and so on, but to share openly as I am with you right now, and then to respond to invitations. I don't want to be part of any sense that it's up to me to change others or to change other communities. That's not my role. My role is to respond to invitations, and then when I respond to invitations, to just walk the journey together with my friends. And as we walk the journey together, we learn new things, and I continue to learn new things, both about myself as I'm mindful and self-aware, and about the community to which I'm invited. And then, as I do all of this, one of my roles then is to educate my own people. And one of the things, I have a blog that I've written, and I haven't had a chance to put it up, but what I'm advocating to my own people is that in schools across Canada, everybody should learn the essentials of the Indigenous language that was spoken originally on the land where they are situated. And because there are lessons to be learned from the land, and the people who have been on this land for thousands of years have learned the lessons from the land, and the lessons from the land have shaped the language. And so there are certain things that are not clearly translatable, and so people should learn these untranslatable words so that they have a sense of what are the lessons from the land that we're living on. And if that were to happen, the sense of respect for the first peoples who were there would go up, because they are the ones who are the experts on what people are learning about. As one is deeply aware of oneself and deeply aware of the community and what's around, it's possible to come up with what David Peat has called gentle actions. So these emerge out of a profound awareness, and out of that profound awareness there can be an insight as to what could make a difference. And just one little example, when I was in Ujabugamu, and we had a little dialogue. One of the people, Wally was his name, who was immersed in the community and was getting a sense that we can think creatively. And as he listened to the young people and the challenges for young people, he said, you know, there's an abandoned kind of blueberry farm, and one of the things that could be done is we could take this over and use it as a teaching place for young people to learn business. So they could work on the blueberry farm. It would create some jobs and some income, but they'd also learn about business. But you start with a small action and build on it and continue. And one action leads to another, and so there's a ripple effect of gentle actions that can really make a difference. But the gentle actions come out of this mindful awareness of both the community and oneself, and listening to oneself as to what might be emerging in one's own mind about what could be done. So thank you again for allowing me to share this with you. And if any of you do want to send me an email about your responses, I would welcome that. So you see it up there on the screen. I really wish you all the best for the rest of your conference, and not just the conference, but for the gentle actions that are going to start taking place as a result of your own self-awareness and your own compassionate listening to and being aware of what's going on in your own families and communities. Miigwech.